removed the safety catch, and I stood up slowly, expecting the Sable to jump up and run. And the Sable then, as I stood up, the Sable saw me, and it just came straight for me, jumped up and just came straight towards me. But it happened so quickly, and the dart gun had a full power scope on it. I didn't have a chance to even raise the rifle before the Sable was on top of me. And as it turned its head to the side to hook me with its horns, I fired the dart gun from point blank range and then threw myself backwards. And
welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here. Welcome to episode 357 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. Kevin Robertson is back again today to talk about sable hunting. Just like we have done in the past, we dive right into the details of sable in this episode. How big they get, where they live, why they are different from other species of plains game, and, of course, how to hunt them. As always, we talk about cartridge and bullet selection as well as terminal ballistics. Kevin also shares 2 stories of extremely close calls he personally has had with sable over the years. Be sure to listen to the very end of this episode. We share his first near-death encounter at the very beginning of this episode, like you just heard the teaser for, and then we share the other episode with the story where a sable actually inflicted a pretty serious injury to him then at the very tail end of this episode. Before we get started, if you want to hunt Africa, to include sable, but also other game like buffalo, other plains game, we are now full for 2025. Same thing for June and July 2026. We do still have some availability remaining for the other months in 2026, though. I am recording this in January of 2025, right in the middle of the rainy season for South Africa. We have received lots of rain there over the last few weeks. So the hunting is looking like it will be outstanding this year in 2025 and into next year in 2026. Visit bestSafariHunt.com for more details, or email me, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com. We'll set you up with your dream hunt in Africa. Next, let me know what you want to hear in future episodes. This is the last episode in this particular Africa hunting miniseries, but I will do another one this summer, and of course I will do another one again in early 2026. If you listen on Spotify, leave a comment on this episode with topic requests for future episodes. If you listen to this podcast on Apple or another podcast service, just leave a review and in the comment, put your topic request. While you're at it, make sure you give the show a 5-star rating. These requests can be for Africa-related topics, but they don't have to be. Just let me know what you want to hear in the future. Finally, make sure you are on my email list. If you like the podcast, you will love the emails I send out every weekday about hunting, shooting, ballistics, etc. Sign up at the link in the show notes or at biggamehuntingpodcast.com/ebook. Okay, let's dive into things with Kevin talking about sable. Good evening, Kevin. Thank you so much for joining me on the show again.
it's a pleasure, John. I've been looking forward to this for some time now because it's a while since we last spoke.
Yes, definitely. Maybe about a year since you were last on. It's been too long. I saw you at the Dallas Safari Club show, so even though you haven't been on the show super recently, I saw you here, and it was good to see that. But it's good to have you back. I'm excited to talk to you about sable. Everyone always enjoys hearing your hair-raising and interesting stories of encounters with wildlife and all of that. I'm sure you have some good stories along those lines about sable. Can you share one with us to start the show off tonight?
I can, John, because as you know, sable are very dear to my heart because I had a herd of sable for nearly 20 years on my ranch in Zimbabwe. And I love them dearly. I'd go and see them every day. So it's an antelope that fascinates me, and I'm very involved with them here in Texas as well. So, I've been in this business for, nearly, 3 decades now, and I've had my close shaves of coming close to a serious accident. And the closest I've ever been coming to being killed in the bush was from a sable cow. Can you believe it? Sable occurred naturally in the Croy area of Zimbabwe, where I had my farm and I had my veterinary practice. And one of my friends and farmers in our area was a guy called Dave Roper, and he had a small camp, about 100 acres, where he had a small herd of sable. And then he purchased a new farm, or the adjacent farm, and he built himself a new game camp, and he brought in a helicopter and a catch crew, we know, where they use those sort of plastic tents to make like a funnel-shaped arrangement where they chase the sable in with a helicopter, and then they just run them straight onto a vehicle. That worked well, but there was an old sable cow that escaped the capture event, and she was all on her own in about this 100 acres. And he came to me and he said, listen, it's too expensive to bring the helicopter back just to catch this one sable. Could I not try and go and dart her? So I had a dart gun in those days, and I had some atropine and some xylazine, which was the drugs that we could use to dart the animal. And I thought, yeah, well, I could certainly go and give it an attempt to go and try and dart this animal. But the drug we used for darting in those days, or M99, or atropine as it was called, was extremely dangerous. It's a very concentrated form of morphine, and a drop will kill you in about 20 seconds if you happen to inject yourself by mistake. So whenever you had to work with this drug, you had to have someone with you to administer the antidote, because theoretically, the darts we used, you have to fill those darts through the needle. So it's quite a delicate operation. If you happen to just drop the syringe or prick yourself with the needle, you generally fall unconscious before you've got time to draw up the antidote. So I took the district nurse, a friend of ours. She was the nurse, and she was there carrying the antidote just in case I made a mistake. And you can imagine this poor old sable cow had been traumatized by being chased by a helicopter, and she was all on her own. And then I was able to herd animals. They definitely don't like being on their own. And darting with a dart gun is pretty similar to bow hunting. You have to get within 30 yards, and the velocity of a dart's about the same as the velocity of an arrow. So it proved to be extremely difficult to try and get a shot at this sable, because she would run and trying to stalk her. And I took one shot at her as she was running, and I sort of swung through and pulled the trigger, and the dart happened to deflect it off a branch. So I missed her with my first shot. And there was a little kopje, a little rocky ridge or rocky outcropping in this 100 acres where the sable was. And we climbed to the top of it, and I was sitting with the nurse, and I pulled another dart. And as I was watching, I saw the sable going to lie down in a patch of hyperenia, which is this really long thatching grass. And I said to the nurse, told her to stay on top of this little rocky outcrop, because when I got down to it, I was going to stalk this sable. So when I got down to the bottom, I couldn't be able to see where the sable was, and I needed her to direct me left or right or forward. And that worked quite well. So I checked the wind, and I sort of approached the sable where I knew the sable was from downwind, and I got on my stomach, and I leopard crawled towards her. And as I was crawling over this, I would look up at the nurse, and she would direct me left or right until eventually I got to about 20 yards from the sable. And it was lying in this grass, and I could see it through the grass, but I didn't want to take a shot through the grass. My thought was I was pretty naive in those days, but I was just going to stand up. And my thought was that the sable would see me, and it would jump up and run away, and it would run directly away from me. And I'd have an opportunity to shoot it in its rump with the dart. So the dart gun had a full power scope. So I removed the safety catch, and I stood up slowly, expecting the sable to jump up and run. And the sable then, as I stood up, the sable saw me, and it just came straight for me, jumped up and just came straight towards me. But it happened so quickly, and the dart gun had a full power scope on it. I didn't have a chance to even raise the rifle before the sable was on top of me. And as it turned its head to the side to hook me with its horns, I fired the dart gun from point blank range, and then threw myself backwards, and the sable swung its head round, and its horn bounced off my belly, and I was wearing an overall with a zipper, and the horn pierced underneath the zip and came out the other side of my overall. So I was actually stuck on the sable's horns as I fell backwards, and I kicked with my feet, and thank God the zip of the zip broke, and I managed to fall free because I was actually stuck on the sable's head. And as I hit the ground, I managed to kick her in the face with both my feet. And luckily the sable turned and ran off, and she had the dart in her neck, and well, 5 minutes later she was fast asleep. But if I had been 6 inches closer to her, I would have got a sable horn through my left kidney, and that probably would have been the end of me. So that was a very lucky escape, and a typical example of how aggressive sable can be. They can be extremely aggressive animals. You know, there are a few antelope in Africa that are really aggressive, and that sable is certainly one of them.
My goodness, geez. So I've heard that bushbuck are also an aggressive antelope. Is that true? And if so, how do they compare to sable in that way?
Now, bushbuck are just a hell of a lot smaller. Now, quite a few people have been killed by bushbuck because they can be extremely aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I'm in the wildlife exotic industry here in Texas, and we've got Arabian oryx here, and Arabian oryx are just as aggressive. They're extremely aggressive. They do not like dogs, and one of the ranches where I consult on, the ranch manager had a beautiful tracking dog. He used to help track, you know, wounded deer and stuff, and he was just driving around the ranch and had the dog on the back of his truck. And he drove past a herd of Arabian oryx and didn't think anything of it, and drove all the way back to the lodge, which is about 1.5 miles. And a Arabian oryx cow followed him all the way, and he didn't realize that this oryx was running after his pickup truck. And as he stopped at the lodge and his dog jumped off, this oryx just came in and killed his dog.
Oh my goodness.
So, yeah, no, they are extremely aggressive.
Jeez. And so sable are not only aggressive, but they're just a really big animal, quite a bit bigger than a bushbuck and even bigger than an oryx. How big is a mature sable bull?
He'll weigh 500 pounds. 520 is about as heavy as it gets. So that's about the size of a cow elk. So they are a big, stocky animal. They weigh about 500 pounds.
How do they compare size-wise to, say, a mature kudu bull?
Pretty much weigh a little bit more, but, you know, kudu have got longer legs, so they're a bit taller. Mm-hmm. And kudu are narrow, slab-sided animals. You know, kudu like to live in thick bush, so we call them slab-sided. You know, they're narrow and deep. Sable is more rounder and more stocky, but probably weigh pretty much the similar weight when they're fully mature.
Okay. Very interesting. Well, tell us a little bit more about sable in terms of where they normally live, what they eat, that sort of thing.
Okay, sable are Africa's aristocrats. You know, I believe that they're the nobility of the antelope species in Africa. They're never a really abundant species. You know, you don't get hundreds of them like you do with wildebeest or impala or things like that. They occur in relatively small family groups. The most I've ever seen, well, I'm going to talk a little bit later about the sable I had on my ranch in Zimbabwe, but I've never seen more than 40 sable in one herd. And I had a very good friend, a veterinary colleague of mine. He's probably the father of sable breeding in South Africa. And he imported a lot of sable from Malawi. And he said that when he was catching these sable and bringing them to South Africa, he never found a sable herd that had more than 40 sable in the herd. So a sable herd would be a dominant bull, and you'd have probably 10 to maybe 20 cows maximum, and then their followers, which would make up a herd of roughly about 40 would be about as big as you would get. Mm-hmm. Sable are selective long grass grazers. And I was always amazed when I used to watch my sable on my farm. We had a grass called hyperenia, which is tall thatching grass, and I remember sitting watching a sable bull, and he would walking through these areas of this long grass, and you'd pick one leaf off every plant. So they eat sort of about 3 or 4 feet off the ground. They never graze really low on the ground unless it's freshly burnt clay areas where the grass is coming up really green. They do eat leaves occasionally, and I had a friend that was just been to see the giant sable in Angola, and he was telling me that the diet of the this giant sable in Angola is very different to the giant, that's for the diet of common sable. They eat mainly fallen leaves. So then they eat around anthills or termite mounds, because termite mounds are very rich in minerals, and the leaves, the trees that grow on these termite mounds, when their leaves drop, that seems to be the diet of the giant sable. But when I used to watch my sable, I very rarely saw them browsing. They were sort of 90% would be grazing animals.
Okay, very interesting. Now, you've mentioned common sable, you mentioned giant sable. I've also heard of a Roosevelt sable. Tell us where in the different parts of Africa they live.
Okay, so there are basically four subspecies of sable. You've got the southern sable, that's basically, that would be occur in South Africa and Zimbabwe. And then of course, you have the giant sable that occurs in Angola. And then you have what they call the Zambian sable. And the Zambian sable are, supposedly their horns are substantially bigger than the southern sable. And they occur in western Zambia, in western Tanzania. These are the species that occur north of the Zambezi River. Mm-hmm. So the southern sable is in South Africa and Zimbabwe. They occur basically south of the Zambezi. And then the eastern side of Africa, we have in northern Mozambique and in southern Tanzania and up into Kenya, you have what they call the eastern sable. And that eastern sable is also known as the Roosevelt sable or the Simba sable, because they occur in the Simba Reserve in Kenya. So sable occur in South Africa, they occur in Mozambique, they occur in Zimbabwe, they occur in Zambia, Botswana, and Namibia, up in the Kapiti strip of Namibia. They occur in Tanzania and Kenya and in Zaire. That's basically the countries where you'll find sable, and then the four different subspecies occur in their respective areas.
Now, the giant sable, is it physically bigger in the body or physically bigger in the horns than the others, or both?
It's substantially bigger in the horns. Body size, they're not really bigger than a really big southern sable. I've seen a full body mount of a giant sable that's in the Field Museum in Chicago. I went there to see the man-eating lions of Tsavo, and in that same display area, there's a giant sable there. And it certainly didn't strike me as being significantly bigger than the sable I used to have on my ranch, but the horns are just substantially bigger.
Yeah, you say in the perfect shot too that the number one giant sable's horns are 18 inches larger than the highest scoring typical sable. Man, that is gigantic.
Yeah, no, the number one giant sable, the horns were 65 inches. Yeah, that was shot in 1949.
My goodness, wow.
And the biggest other common species sable that's ever been recorded is 58 and 1/8 is the sort of the current biggest at the moment. And I'm pretty sure there was some speculation that the Western Zambian sable, that's up against the Angola, there might have been some interbreeding between the giant sable and the Western sable, because everybody in South Africa, where people are breeding sable antelope, the most desirable for horn size is the Western Zambian sable. And there was some speculation that there might be might have been some crossbreeding at some stage where those giant sable genes are in the Western Zambian gene pool.
Now, what would you say is quote unquote typical sable habitat?
We call it Nyamba woodland. It's a savanna woodland. So, and where my farm was just outside Karori was known as Nyamba woodland. So it's a fairly wooded area, but the trees are far apart and grassland, and savanna grasslands. They don't occur in swamps. They don't occur in deserts. They occur in areas where there's where long grass is common and abundantly available. But the big thing about sable are not water dependent. I mean, they are water dependent, but they don't have to drink every day. And it's quite interesting. When I was in the Kruger National Park, I was near a little town called Hoedspruit. Way back in the olden days, sable were the most common antelope in that area. And then the Kruger National Park was developed, and it became a popular tourist attraction, and tourists want to see animals. And where do you see animals? You see animals around water points. So in their wisdom, the park's officials started building dams and drilling boreholes and creating artificial water points. And that attracted the species that are water dependent, like wildebeest and impala. And of course, where there's lots of prey animals, that's where there's lots of predators. And as these more water dependent species increased in number, so the sable numbers decreased. And now there's probably less than 100 sable in the whole of the Kruger National Park, mainly because they've lost their habitat. So sable are, as I mentioned, are Africa's aristocrats. They don't want to mix with the peasants, so they go into areas where there are very few other animals. So they'll walk long distances to water. And my friend who just visited the giant sable in Angola, he said that those sable will walk 20 miles to water.
Wow.
They only drink every 3 to 4 days. So they go into areas where there are no water-dependent species. So in that area, there'll be kudu have to drink every day, impala drink every day, wildebeest have to drink every day. Waterbuck have very high water requirements, so they're always close to water. And sable they're not the world's greatest mothers. So when they have their calf, the calf is hidden for the first 2 weeks of its life, and the mothers will leave the calves, and then they go off to graze, and they'll only come back 2-3 times a day to suckle them. So you can imagine these newborn sable calves are very vulnerable to predation. If there's hyenas or leopards or jackals or even lions will take them. So the sable live in areas where nobody else wants to live, so that that's just the way they are. So, and because they have this nature of going into areas that are far from water, their chances of survival are great, but they're never an abundant species. You know, you never see hundreds of sable. You only see these select sort of small groups of these very special and very beautiful animals.
You know, it's an interesting thing that you say. So you talk about how they would live often by themselves in areas, and they don't need as much water as other animals do. And then the fact that the mothers in particular don't seem to at least have an instinct to do things that would, say, stay with their calf to protect it from predators. But in their ideal situation, there's not a lot of impala or any other animals around that would attract a lot of predators. And so in theory, most of the time, it would seem like in a lot of these areas where the sable really want to be, there just wouldn't be a lot of predators. So they don't need to be protecting their calf all the time. Is that kind of your understanding of the situation?
That sums it up completely. You know, and I'm in the exotic industry here in Texas. I work with 4 ranches, and I keep saying to the cowboys and, the Mexican hands that go around and feed, often they drive around and in the middle of nowhere, they'll see a young newborn baby sable just hiding in some thick grass. And their first instinct is to say, oh, the thing's been abandoned. And they walk up and grab it to come and, because sable are, worth only $50,000-$60,000 here in Texas. And I keep saying, for heaven's sake, just don't touch it. Just leave it, because that's part of their natural habit. They just leave you see this tiny little sable, and there's no other sable in sight. They're just all on their own, hiding away, and it's just the way they are. So all the ranch hands, everybody knows now, if you see a sable on its own, you just don't touch it. You don't even go near it. Just leave it, because mama will come back and feed it when the time is right.
If you are in a situation like that, though, where, say, you mess with the calf and the mother does happen to be nearby, and you talk about how aggressive and strong they are, that could be a situation where a person could be in a world of hurt then from that.
You'd be in a self-defense situation. You have to shoot. She'll come for you for sure. I mean,
yeah.
I've got another story a bit later on. I've seen a sable charge unprovoked, and you don't want to be on the wrong side of sable, that's for sure.
Is it common for male sable to fight each other?
Oh, they do, because sable are pretty much like buffalo in the way that they manage. You'll have a dominant herd bull, and he obviously, how does he get to become a dominant herd bull? He gets there from fighting. They get down on their front knees and they spar with those horns, and eventually it's a push and shove, and they don't try and kill each other, but they're definitely, you can see, they'll have a fight. And then that animal, it's the one wins the fight, and he's the dominant territorial bull. And he'll have a territory, and he'll have the herd will be in his territory. Just sometimes doesn't spend all the time with them. Sometimes he goes off on his own, because the herds are led by the oldest, wisest cow, sort of similar to like buffalo. But in a sable herd, when no sable will mate with its own daughters, so when his own daughters will get to becoming sexually mature, which is about into their 2.5 years old, they're into their third year, those sable will leave the herd, and also as soon as a male that's born into the herd, as soon as he starts coming close towards sexual maturity, he'll get chased out of the herd. And in situations where we're breeding sable in sort of in intensive areas now, as soon as that sable gets to like 12 to 15 months, certainly the male sable, we've got to take them out of the herd. Otherwise, the dominant bull will kill them. Now, they are aggressive. They'll kill each other for sure. So you have to be they must be in big enough areas where when it's time for the young males to get evicted from the herd, they've got to be able to get away and get out, because that if it's too small an area, the dominant bull will kill them.
Mm-hmm. So a normal herd will consist of a dominant bull, some number of cows, their calves, and then the cows and bulls from previous years that are a little bit older but not quite sexually mature yet. And then the males will get kicked out when they're a couple years old. Then when they get to the point where they're big enough and strong enough, one of them will challenge that herd bull. He'll get kicked out. And so you'll have the turnover like that, like you described with buffalo, where you'll have a couple of breeding herds in various areas with some small bachelor herds intermixed with them.
Yes, and you also get old Duggar sable as well. I mean, once a sable bull has been displaced, once he's lost his dominancy, he will then just go off on his own. Just pretty much like an old Duggar buffalo.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the guys that would make them, but they should be the best trophies in the old bulls, and they make for really good hunting experiences.
What is a normal age, would you say, for a dominant breeding bull in a herd?
When he's sexually mature at 5, I mean, that's when he's fully mature at 5 years old. And he'll probably go 5 or 6 or 7 until he's 8 or 9, maybe. They can live up to 15 or 16, and they have been known to live up to 18 years in captivity. And it's quite easy to age a buffalo a sable, because when he's fully mature at 5 in his 5th year or 6th year, he starts to develop what we call secondary growth on his horns. Are you familiar with the term secondary growth?
I've heard it, but can you explain it for us, please?
Okay, the sable will have regular rings on their ridges on their horns. And as once they fully mature, those rings or those ridges at the base of the horn start to get compressed. It's like they get concertinaed. So the space between those rings becomes much shorter, or they're almost sort of touching each other. In a normal sable, so there's sort of like an inch or half an inch between each successive ridge. The secondary growth is when those ridges start getting compressed, and secondary growth grows at about an inch a year. So if it starts at 5, so if you find a sable bull he's got 5 inches or even 6 inches of secondary growth, and it's very distinctive to see, then that bull's, that bull is then getting towards the end of his sexually active life. So he'd be like a Duggar that's 12 years old and now he's finished breeding. So that bull will be 8 or 9, even 10 years old. And I was talking to some of my PH friends at the recent Dallas Safari Club show, and they were saying that their PHs, they shoot a sable bull that it hasn't got he's got less than 5 inches of secondary growth, and they find those PHs because that bull they're shooting a prime breeding bull. They've got to wait for that secondary growth to grow out in 5 or 6 inches. Then you know that bull's sort of on the back end of his breeding tenure, and that's making the really good trophies.
So we've talked about sable in a couple of different contexts here. You've talked about them in your current job as a veterinarian in a wildlife breeding operation here in Texas. You've talked about hunting them, truly wild free-range sable in Africa. Tell us a little bit about this herd of sable you had on your farm in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, so I bought my farm in 1985. That was just after the end of the 15-year-long bush war, as it was called.
Mm-hmm.
And when I acquired the farm, my parents-in-law bought the farm during the war, and basically the farm had been abandoned. In 1981, there was independence in 1980, and I went to Zimbabwe in 1981, and Catherine and I got married, and I took over the management of their cattle, and there were six naturally occurring sable on Halstead Farm. And when I took it over in 1985, I purchased it in 1985. There were six sable on it, and they were very skittish and very wild. And 15 years later, there were 120. I never hunted a sable on the ranch. I just loved them and protected them. And I never game fenced the ranch, but what I did, I employed 3 game scouts, just to keep all the undesirables out. And I would go and see these sable, go and look for them every day. And they religiously doubled in number every 2.5 years. So I started with 6, and 2.5 years later, there were 12. And then 5 years later, there were 24. And then as the herd got close to 40, it would get to like 35 or 38 or 39 sable, then the herd would split. And I think it was splitting because it was the 2-year-old heifers that were born into that herd would then be kicked out of the herd. So the herd numbers would split. And eventually that herd would, 2.5 years later, those 2 herds would then double again, and then they would split again. So I populated the whole of that area where my sable were, and there were 120 of them 15 years later.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a great pleasure, and I just love to go and watch them but it was quite interesting because I was basically a cattle farmer, and if I put my cattle into the herd, into the pasture where the sable were, those sable would leave within 20 minutes. The sable would leave. They would not tolerate being anywhere near the cattle, and they don't jump. So I just had normal barbed wire cattle fences, and the sable they just get down on their knees and they put their head underneath the wire and push the fence up, and they go underneath the fence. They don't go over a fence. And then they would just go where there were no cattle. And then when, we would all kick off our farms in the early 2000s, and within 2 weeks, all my sable would kill. Sable are a very aggressive animal, and they're actually easy to kill with dogs because the sable will stand and fight. He'll back into a bush or stand and fight it out, and then they were quite easy to spear. Those spears of the sable and policemen. That was just those crazy times. And that sable herd that I loved for 15 years was wiped out within 15 days. It was a very sad time in my life.
My goodness, geez. So you talk about when you first moved in on this farm in the early 80s, the sable were very few in number and they were very skittish. Had they been poached aggressively during the war for people to eat?
I'm sure. There were still people farming there. Yeah, but I'm sure that they were poached, probably, and because I don't really know, but I'm pretty sure they were, because they were. I only have 6 sable would be a rather unusual number. There was a bull and a young bull and a couple of cows. I'm sure that was an unusual size, and then normally you would find 15 or 20 sable together. So I'm sure that the remnants of that herd had probably been poached.
What other antelope species of wildlife, if any, lived on your farm?
Oh, we had Zaka. We had some Orabi were there, Orabi, Zaka. But I was very keen on growing pastures. My grandfather was a very well-known agronomist, and I think some of those genes passed off on me, and I started developing what we call legume reinforced pastures, and I actually doubled the carrying capacity on my ranch by growing these different grasses. And so eventually and my farm was probably double the size of most of the other farms in that area. So I eventually donated or created what I called my game section. It was an area on the farm that was quite rocky and hard to get to. And I created the right environment. So when the sable started to increase and then the game scouts I'd employed, all of a sudden impala appeared. All of a sudden we had warthogs. All of a sudden we had bushbuck. All of a sudden we had waterbuck. I created this little game reserve by nothing more than creating the right environment. And I was almost convinced that somehow game animals almost seem to communicate with each other to say, hey, here's a piece of land where nobody's hassling us, nobody's shooting us, we're happy here, we looked after, and I actually put a bit of food out for them. I mean, even the kudu appeared. So I created this little, what I called my game section by nothing other than creating the right environment where the animals knew that they were safe and protected.
It is interesting how quickly something like that can turn around. Like you say, if you present the ideal conditions for the animals. But was this an example, though, of, say, aside from the few diker and whatnot that you had there at the beginning, that one of the reasons the Sable liked that area so much was that there just wasn't a lot of other animals in there?
It certainly was, and there was a a couple of little rocky outcrops, which they seemed to really like, and there was a nice big flay there, which I used to burn it in the, in the springtime. And the grass used to come up nice and green, because in the rainy season, the flays were almost a little bit like a marshy area, but there was lots of moisture then. If you had to burn it, you get that green growth would come through, and the Sable just used to love that. And, also I've sort of managed the environment, particularly for the Sable, and I just made sure they were safe and made sure they were happy, and they just flourished.
That is very interesting. It's also funny what you were saying about how they wouldn't jump the fence and how they would normally leave pretty soon after the cows would come in. I assume that wouldn't bother some animals, but it would bother the aristocrats of the bush, as you say. We talked a little bit about predation earlier, especially with regards to animals preying on young. But with their size and their aggressiveness and the size of their horns, I'd imagine an adult Sable is a pretty tough cookie for even a lion to take down. But then again, I do imagine that it happens. Do you have any stories or encounters that you know about to share with us in that vein?
I do. So Catherine and I got married on Lake Kariba. So and this was in 1981, and we were married on the middle of the lake on the old ferry. We had a fantastic party, and then after as the ferry was going back to Andorra Harbour, Catherine and I got in a speedboat and we sped off to Fothergill Island, which is one of the tourist attractions on Lake Kariba. The lake was quite low that year, and Fothergill Island wasn't actually an island. It was joined by a split of land to the mainland, which is the Matusadonna Game Reserve. It's on the eastern side of Lake Kariba. And when we got there, all the guests at the Fothergill Island were in a real tither. And what had transpired, there was the dining area was in what we call the boma. Are you familiar with a boma is, John?
Yes.
Okay, so the boma is like a circular area. It's probably 50, 60 feet in diameter, and all the tables set out, and they had made with logs sort of set in the ground vertically to create a sort of like a barrier. Because sometimes at Lake Kariba, the wind can blow, and then these logs created a windbreak. And the diners were all sitting and eating lunch, and two young lions attacked a Sable bull. So with lions, it's pretty similar to what happens with Sable. So male lions are born into a pride, and when they're 2 years old, they're as big as a lioness. And then in their third year, when they start becoming sexually mature, they get kicked out of the pride. And the young lions, those young males then have to fend for themselves until they're big enough and strong enough to make a play for a pride takeover, which normally occurs when they're in their fifth or in their sixth year. So they've got 3 years to go and live on their own. And these two young 3-year-old lions attacked a mature Sable bull right inside Fothergill Island camp. And what the Sable bull did, he backed himself up against the wall of the boma, and he fought these lions. And the people in having their lunch could hear this commotion going on outside, and next minute over the 7-foot high boma structure came the body of a 3-year-old lion, which landed in amongst all the diners.
Oh my God!
Sable hooked it with its horn, and it threw that lion over the boma in amongst all the people having their lunch. He was thrown dead. The lion was dead. But you can imagine that caused quite a commotion when you're having your lunch and all of a sudden the body of a lion lands in amongst the front of your table. But that Sable killed the second lion as well. So when Kath and I arrived, we checked into the reception at Fothergill Island. they said, "Oh God, you're a vet. Oh, please come and have a look at these two dead lions." And there these two dead lions were lying there, both of them killed by that Sable.
Jeez.
So, and then another story I've got for you. There was a guy called Andy Cockett. He was a professional hunter, and he was a friend of mine. And he farmed at a place called Tengwe, which is just south of, or to the east of the Croy farming area where I had my farm. And he had what he called an extension. It was an area that went down to the Sinyati River. There's a very famous place in Kariba called the Sinyati Gorge, which is a very famous fishing spot. Anyway, there was also really good sable country, and he had a quota to hunt sable in this area. And one day, it was at the end of the hunting season, he phoned me to say, what did I know about horn neoplasms, horn cancers? So I said, geez, I didn't know anything. And he said, no, you'd see the sable bull that's got this growth on its head. And he thought the only thing he could think about it was some sort of horn cancer or horn growth. Anyway, I looked at my notes and I couldn't figure out that I didn't know anything about horn cancers, and I forgot all about it. And almost a year to the day, he phoned me again. He said, remember I told you about that sable I saw with the growth on his head? He said, well, I shot that sable this afternoon. And that growth on the sable's head turned out to be the mummified carcass of a dog. So it was obviously poachers had gone through the area, and this sable had horned this dog. It was apparently quite a big dog, about the size of a German Shepherd. And that dog obviously landed, the horn went right through the dog, and it landed right on the top of on the sable's head. And it was the dry winter season and just dried out and turned into a mummy. And that sable walked around with a dog on his head for a year.
My goodness.
That's typical of a sable. That would just dedicate it. I think one of the reasons I love them so much is that it's an animal that just don't take no crap. He's aggressive, and if he has a problem, he sorts it out.
Well, for the listener, there is a story involving a sable and a lion along the lines of what Kevin told earlier, but a little bit different. It involves a lion going into a swimming pool in the book Death in the Long Grass. So take a look at that book for another very interesting story about a sable defending itself when is necessary. So we've talked at length about their size, their aggression, how you don't want to be on the wrong end of those horns. Tell us a little bit about some of the most common ways to hunt sable, say like that you practiced when you were in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, mainly it's sort of spot and stalk. Sable are very distinctive animals. That black of a sable sticks out distinctively. And a lot of the time, I've hunted sable in the Zambezi Valley. I've hunted sable in Matetsi. I've hunted sable in Mozambique. And generally you would be just driving around and you'd just see a sable, and then you'd look at it, evaluate, and get out and spot and stalk. That's probably the most common way of doing it. But I have, on occasions, and there was a situation when I hunted in Matetsi where we tracked a sable. Because sable tracks are very distinctive. They've got this real arrowhead shaped track. And probably another indication of what sable are like. I was with a Spanish client, a rather excitable Spanish client, and in Matetsi Matetsi is an area close to Wangi National Park in Zimbabwe, and it's very famous for its sable. There's big plays there, and it's a very famous sable area. And we stalked the sable, and we got about 120 meters from it, and there was a sort of a donga, like an erosion gully in front of us, and we couldn't get any closer. My client was using a 375, and he was shooting a 300 grain,
Was it a silver tip?
Winchester silver tip, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the sable was exactly side on, and he took a perfect shot into the vital triangle, and he was actually lying down to take the shot. And as soon as he shot, I was also lying down, we both stood up, and that sable shot through the vital triangle, saw us, and he just came straight for us. He aimed an absolute full-out charge. And I'd never experienced it before. And he disappeared into this donga, and he came out the other side. The donga was about 30 meters in front of us. And I said, dude, but his sable's coming. So I quickly jacked around into my 505, and I said to this, Jose, this Spaniard, I said, you better reload your rifle. And as he was coming towards us, I could see he was running out of petrol. He started to stagger, and he fell about 15 meters in front of us. But he was coming straight for us. First time I've ever experienced it, and I've never experienced it again, but I don't know whether the fluke, but he saw us and he just came for us. And he died, 15 meters in front of us.
My goodness. Is the recommended shot placement similar on Sable as it is on other antelope like kudu, for instance?
Yeah, you just shoot them straight on the shoulder. Mm-hmm. In the middle of the vital triangle. You know, that vital triangle, that's the high shoulder. That's not the high shoulder, spinal shoulder. It's just the middle of the vital triangle, and that takes out the top of the heart through the center of the lung. So what we would do, we just go straight up. If it's exactly broadside on, you just go straight up the line of the front leg and shooting a little bit higher than 1/3 and a little bit low halfway up the body, and goes through the top of the heart. They'll run for 150 meters and then game over. You don't want to shoot them in the neck because, they're such magnificent animals. Sable is most magnificent as either a full body mount or a shoulder mount. So certainly no neck shots or head shots, anything like that. And then you would shoot them just on the shoulder.
Mm-hmm. And was this an unusual situation with the Sable, the guy shot that turned and ran towards you? Normally when a guy shoots them, they run away and then
normally they would run away, but I think I don't know what it was, because we jumped up as soon as the shot was fired. We both jumped up, and he definitely looked and saw us, and but he came straight for us. And now haven't really heard of it happening to anybody else. But he was definitely. I mean, there was no reason he could have run in any direction, but why he ran straight towards us and he had to run through a donga to get to us was also made me think that he was deliberately trying to get to us.
What cartridge and bullet type do you like for Sable?
Every Sable that I've hunted has been part of a buffalo hunt. So normally you would just use the whatever you're using for your first shot on a buffalo. So the 375 I just love the 375, and it's amazingly effective cartridge. And because they're quite big and tough and quite blocky animals, whatever bullet you use for your first shot at a buffalo is very effective on Sable. Mm-hmm. If you're going to hunt a Sable exclusively, probably 7mm would probably be as light as the smallest I would go, and certainly 175 grain bullet, or maybe even 160 grain if you're going to go with a modern metal like a Barnes X or something like that. But certainly no lighter than that. A 270 maybe at a push with a 150 grain bullet, but certainly 7mm would be what I would consider my minimum caliber. But a lot of guys even shoot Sable with 416s if the 416 is their preferred buffalo cartridge. And a lot of Sable are hunted on as part of a package on a buffalo hunt. So that normally if it's a buffalo included in a plains game hunt, if there's a Sable involved, then you would just shoot the Sable whatever you're using for your buffalo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, in that same vein, in our very first podcast interview you and I did almost 5 years ago now, you shared a story about a bullet failure on a Sable. Can you share that story with us again?
Yeah, I can, John. So, I think I mentioned before when there were areas in Zimbabwe that were reserved for South Africa, Zimbabwe citizens and permanent residents, and the staff at the American Embassy in Harare were considered as permanent residents. And I took one of the staff members on a hunt into the Chirara Safari area, and it was a buffalo leopard hunt. And then he was going to come up to the Croy area where we were going to hunt a Sable. And for the occasion, he used what we called Art Alpen's triad of bullets. So the triad of bullet was a round-nosed monolithic solid, and then he had a bullet called the Dead Tough, which is a bonded, thick-jacketed bullet suitable for buffalo. And then he had a bullet called the Lion Load. And the Lion Load was just a copper cup which was filled with lead that wasn't bonded, and it had a round nose. So all three bullets had exactly the same shape, and they all had exactly the same weight, and it was very easy with careful reloading. You could get all bullets to shoot to the same point of aim. So it was a really handy combination. Obviously the Dead Tough you would use for the first shot at the buffalo, which we did, and then the The round nose monolithic solid was for buffalo backup shots, and then the leopard that we used, we shot it with this lion load. But in those hot conditions of the Zambezi Valley, in that area, the Makuti Chirari area, the copper of the lion load became tarnished. It got sort of like a green or mold on it, and eventually almost the color of the bullets changed, because when they were brand new, you could easily distinguish between the lion load and the dead tough, because one was the brass color and the other one was the copper color. But it was a 2-week hunt, and over that 2 weeks, handling those bullets with sweaty hands, the color of the copper of the lion load actually changed. And I was very worried about shooting using the wrong bullet for the Sable. So to the extent I even painted the primer pocket, put some pink nail varnish on it so we could see the distinguish between the two, because they started to look very similar. Well, of course, the worst thing that happened when we were hunting the Sable up in the Croy area, where it was naturally Sable area, and we eventually found a really nice bull, and there was a slight quartering away shot, and my client shot it perfectly. It was because of quartering away, he shot it sort of about a foot behind the shoulder, and the Sable just dropped to the ground. If it has been lightning struck, and it hit the ground, and then it almost immediately jumped up and ran off before any backing shots could be fired. And our client ejected the cartridge, and I picked up the cartridge case, and only then did I notice that there was pink around the primer rim, and I suddenly realized that he'd shot that Sable with the lion load instead of the dead tough. It was just a common mistake, and I was probably at fault, because I should have made sure that he was loading the right bullet, and he was also very embarrassed that he'd also made the same mistake. Anyway, we shot the Sable with the wrong bullet. It took us, we followed that Sable for 2 days.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, but thank God I had a tracker that was an amazing tracker. He could really track really well. I was special. And we eventually found that Sable, and we stuck with his track, and we eventually killed him. And, only the bullet had totally fragmented in, and because it was shot quite well back behind the shoulder, only a little piece of jacket about the size of a grain of rice had gone through the thoracic wall and was in the lung. And, he was still alive 48 hours later, but we did find him and we did kill him. But it was a real wake-up call that you just make sure that it's the PH's job to make sure that your client loads the right bullet into his rifle, right cartridge into his rifle.
Yeah. My goodness. How does a Sable rank in terms of quality, or how does it compare in terms of toughness compared to something like a blue wildebeest or a kudu or a zebra?
Well, I think a blue wildebeest is known as the poor man's buffalo for a reason, because they can be extremely tough animals. Sable probably pretty close. They're not quite as tough as a blue wildebeest, but certainly tougher than a kudu. I don't think a kudu is a particularly tough animal. But you've got to hit a Sable properly, and they're stocky, they're blocky. When we handle kudu and when we have to dart and move kudu around, when you get your hands on them, you feel like they almost like touching a bull terrier, they've got that hard muscle as opposed to a Labrador that's got sort of soft muscles and stuff like that. No, they're tough, and they can be tenacious, but they're definitely they're not quite as tough as a wildebeest, but they're certainly tougher than a kudu.
Okay, fair enough. Now, you and I have one more topic to discuss in a second, and we'll get to that. But before we do, I need to ask you the question I'm asking all of my guests on the show this year. You got to choose one to hunt with for the rest of your life. Either a single cartridge, and if you go that route, you can use any bullet, or you can use a single bullet type in any cartridge. What is your choice?
I'll make it easy for you, John. I would love Africa. Our logical choice for the cartridge is the 375 H&H. It'll just do everything, and especially because if your one choice for the rest of your life is obviously going to include some dangerous game.
Mm-hmm.
And if I had to have used one bullet for the rest of my life in the 375, I'd probably use a cup nose solid. A cup nose solid is that the North Fork cup nose solid is that it's a semi-solid and it's got a little cup on it that rivets and it creates a permanent wound channel 3 times its final expanded diameter. And you could shoot anything. I wouldn't shoot an elephant with a frontal brain shot, but quite interesting. A friend of mine has just been to hunt a buffalo in the Makuti area of Zimbabwe, and he was using a 375 Ruger, and he asked me for recommendations on bullet selection, and I said, no, your backing bullet on a buffalo should be a 350 grain .375 cup nose solid. And he happened to say, how will that perform on an elephant? And I said, geez, I have absolutely no experience of shooting an elephant with a cup nose solid, but I said, I'm pretty sure, especially at 350 grains, it'll work fine. And it must have been deja vu, because sure enough, they were tracking buffalo, and they got into a herd of elephants, and they got charged by this elephant cow. Unprovoked, this cow just came for them, and the PA said, you better shoot this thing, and he brained it with a 350 grain North Fork cup nose solid. And he said that elephant just dropped, and it dropped so quickly that his PAs fired a split second or half a second later, and his shot was actually too high, because as he fired, the elephant was already falling. And he sent me a picture of the elephant, and you can see a jet of blood, a stream of blood squirting out of the hole in its forehead about 5 or 6 inches. There's an absolute continuous stream of blood, which tells me that cup nose solid went into the brain cavity. And because the brain gets a huge amount of blood, and there was still, blood pressure within the animal. And that release of that blood pressure was making the blood squirt out of the elephant's forehead.
My goodness.
So with that cup nose, so that's how it worked perfectly. So, but that was elephant cow, when its head was down. It was really, he shot it at about 10 meters. It was very close, very lucky call. And that bullet worked. So he was very lucky, but I was very pleased to know that that bullet will work on a charging elephant.
Well, very interesting. Now, I expect nothing less from you. Almost all the Africa people I've been interviewing lately say the 375 is their all-around choice. If they only had to pick one, makes total sense. You can use it on everything from diker to elephant and everything in between. And I also expect nothing less out of you than the North Fork solid or North Fork bullet in general, and that cup nose solid in particular, with your previous affection you have described for those bullets. So very good there. Now, as we wrap up things tonight, you do have one more thing you wanted to discuss with the audience. So tell us what's going on with the Perfect Shot 2.
So the Perfect Shot 2 is, as you know, it was a labor of love. I'm getting towards retirement age, and I'm looking at my finances, and I would think, I'd like to boost my portfolio a little bit. So I've got the original artwork for the Perfect Shot 2. It's the original paintings that the book was printed from. It's an interesting story. So when the Perfect Shot 2 was conceived, the original artist who painted my first set of the paintings, I said to her, listen, we want to do a rise edition with almost double the number of paintings. Would you be prepared to paint them? And she said, I would love to do it, but we've got a bit of a problem. Our daughter needs to go to college, and we're backing to finance her college education. So I said, okay, I'll make an agreement with you. You paint me the set of pictures, and I'll pay for 2 years of your daughter's college. So that's what I did. And I would now like to find a home for this original artwork. I'd like to find somewhere where it will be appreciated. So if anybody has got a trophy room or something like that we would like to acquire these paintings, there are 45 of them, and there are also 45 of the original photographs. So it's the photograph of whatever animal it is, and then onto that same photograph is the anatomy painted by hand by the artist. It took her 2 years to paint all 45. I mean, they are anatomically perfect, and it's beautifully done. And I just would like it to go to somewhere where it's appreciated. So if anybody's interested, they're more than welcome to get hold of me on on my email address, which is on my drkevinrobertson.com website. And yeah, let's see if anybody's interested.
Now, you talk about the paintings of the anatomy. Is this the skeletons that you're talking about that are overlain on the photos in the actual book?
That's it is, yeah. It's all the, we've got my little Perfect Shot 2, the mini version. It's every one of those anatomy skeletons and where the heart and lungs are. But we did it differently. I mean, like buffalo, I've got left hand, right hand side with the full internal anatomy. I've got the full internal anatomy of, I think I did Impala, left hand, right hand side. So that's sure. And then some of the animals, like lion, is leg forward, leg back. Elephants, leg front, leg forward, front, leg back. Going there. So it's substantially more diagrams or paintings than there are in the original Perfect Shot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the Perfect Shot 2, I think I'm looking at it right now. It looks like there's about 30 animals that are in it.
30 animals, but there's 45 paintings altogether. You know.
Okay, all right, I understand. And so we have everything from the little stuff, Diker, Klipspringer, Steenbach, Greisbach, up through the mid-sized antelope, to include Sable, and then, of course, all of the thick-skinned dangerous game. There's also lion in there, and the thin-skinned, and leopard, and then, of course, buffalo, elephant, hippo, rhinoceros. You got crocodile in there, hyena, blessbok, impala, darn near anything that people are going to normally hunt in Africa. You're selling these as a set, then, right?
That's one set, yeah. There's one set, so there's 90 pieces of the 45 painted photographs, and there's another 45 photographs without the anatomy painted on it.
Man, how long did it take you to write that book?
4 years.
Yeah.
So in those days, there was that was done before digital. There were no cell phones. There were no. So we had to all the bones. You had to get the skeletons, boil them, get all the bones out, and then photograph each individual bone. And Kath, my wife, we took 8,500 photographs.
Wow.
To produce that book. Yeah, so it was a 4-year labor of love. So it took me 2 years to collect all the information, and then once I collected all the information, then another 2 years for the artist to paint all those pictures while I was busy writing the book. So yeah, that was 4 years to produce that book.
And so, for instance, say with the Sable here, you have the skeleton, overlaying on the photo. Did you kill a Sable, boil all the bones out, then overlay them on the body appropriately so you know what it all looked like and where everything went?
No. Once you had all the bones, you only need half the thing. So then you lay the skeleton out, put all the vertebrae in the right order, then the front leg bones, and lay all the ribs out and all the vertebrae. Yeah, and then photograph it.
Wow.
Because I didn't know what the shape of a Sable scapula was, So and I knew. And yeah, so we used some of the Sables that we shot. You take the bone and boil them and dry them and lay them all out on the ground, and then photograph each individual bone. And then, being a veterinarian, I could identify the bones. Then I'd go with the artist and say, okay, these are all the vertebrae. This is what they look like when they go together. And then she was just so good. The first anatomy diagram took her 3 weeks to do the first one, and in the end, she could do one in about a couple of days. So.
Wow, that is fascinating. I've often wondered how you did that, and it just sounds like you did it very diligently and patiently, and it was a whole lot of work over the course of a couple of years.
I did cheat a little bit. I must admit, I didn't do the elephant. There's a fully mounted elephant skeleton in the Letaba Museum in the Kruger National Park. So I went and photographed every bone in that elephant, and then there was a white rhinoceros skeleton in the anatomy department of the University of Natal in Pietermaritzburg. So I went all the way there just to photograph that elephant, that rhino skull. And then in the University of Zimbabwe in the veterinary department, there was a fully mounted black rhino skeleton. So I did that as well. But I did actually dissect a white rhino. I went on a white rhino hunt with Conrad for Mark Safaris in Natal, and then I got the opportunity to dissect a rhino that's where all my, with the shape of the heart and all that came from. But the hippo, I could not find a hippo skeleton anywhere. So we shot a hippo, and I just boiled the whole hippo skeleton and got all the bones and put them all together, and that's what created the hippo And I did a giraffe as well, because I have never seen a fully mounted giraffe skeleton anyway. So we had it, and that was a hell of a work, because you don't realize how big a damn giraffe is. To go and get all those bones. It was a labor of love. That's been my life work, that book, and geez, and that was a like to try and find what the heck a bloody giraffe's bones looked like and then I also had to dissect a giraffe, and that is a giraffe's anatomy is unique. His heart sits very far forward and high up in its neck. And they are anatomically perfect. Like black rhino has got 13 ribs, and I think the white rhino's got 12. I mean, so when you count all the bones, I mean, every bone there is anatomically perfect.
That is fascinating. So if somebody wants to purchase this stuff from you, I'll put your website in the show notes. They can get in touch with you that way. And presumably, if they go that route and end up purchasing it from you, you'd be willing to provide a letter, a certificate of authenticity saying that this is the original stuff, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, yes, yeah. So the original set, that was for the perfect one, Rigby, that my favorite gunmakers have acquired it, and that's going to be framed and presented in the Rigby Museum amongst all their famous rifles. So I'm very pleased with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So people visiting Rigby will be able to see it, but that was a much less number of paintings or diagrams than there are in the second set.
Yeah, there's additional shot angles and there's additional animals in the second set is what you're
yes,
saying.
Yeah. I mean, like the first one didn't have Inyala, didn't have reedbuck, didn't have black wildebeest. Those were species that were when I wrote the first book, was in Zimbabwe, or it was in Zimbabwe, and then we got picked out. It was moving to South Africa, so we were additional species to hunt.
Okay. All right. Well, excellent. Kevin, this is great. Hopefully someone listening to this either will be interested or they know someone that will be, and maybe someone will get in touch with you about purchasing that stuff from you. You've been one of the audience's favorite guests over the years on the show, so I hope somehow we'll be able to hopefully repay you for all the time that you've spent talking to me and entertaining my audience over the years and educating them about hunting in Africa. Now, I know you have one more story about a close encounter you had with a sable. Can we close with that story this evening?
When I was in South Africa, I was developing a sable breeding program in the Tamazimbi area, and we purchased 4 sable heifers and a mature sable bull, and they arrived in a truck that had individual compartments, and we offloaded the heifers with no problem, but the bull was in the back corner of the truck, and he just refused to exit the truck. So the guy that delivered them was a veterinary colleague of mine, Dr. Johan Crick, who's a very well-known sable breeder, and he just said, if you climb onto the top of the truck, there's an inspection hatch about 1 meter square, and he said, if you open that hatch, the sable bull will be directly below you. And just let him see that you're there, and that might help him to get out of the compartment that he was in. So I climbed onto the top of this truck, and sure enough, there was this hatch. So I lay down on my belly, and I supported my weight with my right arm, and being left-handed, all I did was I just moved my left hand over this open area, and I could see the sable bull. He was a 2-3 feet below me. And the next minute he reared up and he came out with his horns out through the top of this opening, and he skewered my right arm about 4 inches below my elbow and stuck his horn right through my arm. And the horn went in the top and came out the bottom. And he knew exactly where my arm was, and I don't know if it was a fluke, but there I was on the top of this bloody truck with this great big hole in my arm and blood squirting out anywhere. And I had to climb all the way down, and it was now getting towards evening. The damn thing was still in the truck, so I quickly jumped in my car with blood everywhere and drove into Tamazimbi. And eventually found the doctor's surgery, and there was an emergency number, and I phoned this doctor and said, listen, I've just got a horn stuck through my arm. And he said, well, give me half an hour, I'll be there. So I sat there in great agony until he eventually arrived, and he took one look at that this hole in my arm, and he just stuck his finger into the hole, and it came out the bottom end of my arm. And he said, "Oh, I need to take you into surgery." So I said, "Geez, man, I'm just driven here, and I can't go into surgery because you have to give me an anesthetic, and I have to spend the night, and my wife's all alone on the farm and all that." I said, "Well, can't you just stitch it up with local anesthetic?" And he said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Well, dude, go for it." So I now know what it's like to have a baby, and I know what it's like to have a second baby. Because, man, it was an unpleasant experience. You can still see I've still got the scar on my arm and my dimple in the other side of the arm where the horn came out. Luckily, it didn't miss the bone, but it went right through my forearm from one end to the other. And it was so quick. I mean, and those Sable horns are so damn sharp. It was a rather unpleasant experience. So I carry a permanent reminder of what a Sable can do. And I see it every day.
My goodness, Kevin. So all the time you spent hunting lion and leopard and buffalo and elephant and all that, two of your closest calls and a serious injury in this case as well for the great Doctari was from a Sable.
Yeah. So that's why I have a very great love for them, and I have a very great respect for them as well.
I can definitely understand that. So thank you so much for coming on again tonight to talk about Sable with us.
That's a pleasure, John. I hope your listeners found it interesting.
As always, it's great having Kevin on the show. Contact him through his website, drkevinrobertson.com. Link is in the show notes. If you are interested in purchasing the full set of original photographs and anatomy diagrams for The Perfect Shot 2. Like he mentioned, Rigby purchased the photographs and diagrams for The Perfect Shot 1, the original version of that book. The Perfect Shot 2 has a bunch of additional photographs and additional animals that were not included in the original version of The Perfect Shot. That is what he is selling here. Now, even if you are not interested or able to purchase that set yourself, feel free to pass along this information to someone you know who might be interested. And if you have not already done so, be sure to purchase a copy of Kevin's books, The Perfect Shot 2, the mini edition, It Shouldn't Happen, etc., at thebiggamehuntingblog.com/Kevin. Links to all of those things are in the show notes. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and I can help. Thanks for listening. We'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to thebiggamehuntingblog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.
Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience in their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's LIBSYN, ads.com today.